Do you need to consume carbs before a workout to maximize performance? And if so, how many grams of carbs do you need pre-workout to optimize your gains? To answer this question, I got a research team together and we looked at all the available studies comparing different carbohydrate intakes and measuring strength training performance. This was actually the first systematic literature review on this topic. Up until this point, all reviews have been narrative reviews, which are essentially opinion pieces where the authors are free to include and not include studies as they choose. In our case, we literally included all the available studies. We found 22 relevant studies. Of those, 11 found no significant effects of pre-workout carbohydrate consumption on workout performance. 11 of those did. Of the 22 studies in total that we found, 14 of those found no significant differences in performance of the workout with higher versus lower carbohydrate intakes. So the majority of studies, as a big picture view, did not find effects of carbohydrate intake on how strong you are or how much volume you can do in a workout. Of the 8 studies that did find significant between-group differences, 2 of those interestingly favored lower carbs and 6 of those favored higher carbs. So overall, there was some trend for benefits of higher carbohydrate intakes. Now, if we zoom in on the context of the studies in which carbohydrate intake had a beneficial effect on performance, we find that in those studies, the higher carbohydrate intake group in all cases also had a higher energy intake. In fact, the placebo group or the lower carbohydrate intake group often received no energy intake at all. So they had a lower energy intake and they were actually training in an overnight fasted condition in many cases. So the condition was usually one group goes to the lab in the morning after an overnight fast, doesn't consume anything, does a workout, therefore training completely fasted. And the other group receives carbohydrate intake, essentially a breakfast, before they do the workout. And in that case, of course, we cannot say that it was the carbohydrate intake per se, or simply the energy intake in general that had a positive effect on performance. The lack of a proper placebo control is particularly confounding because in some of the studies, we found that when the higher carbohydrate group, so receiving like a dextrose supplement or something, was compared to nothing, so not even a placebo, there was a beneficial effect of higher carbs versus lower carbs, meaning a beneficial effect of receiving the supplement versus not receiving the supplement. But this could have easily been a non-metabolic effect, a placebo effect or something else, because another group was compared in some of the studies where they received a placebo that was matched in texture and taste to the carbohydrate supplement. And then they found that there was no further benefit compared to the placebo. There was also a study in which they had the placebo either liquid or solid. So it didn't actually have any energy, it was a placebo breakfast. And they found that the solid placebo breakfast, so it was like a modified gel product, improved performance more than the liquid supplement. And they found that it correlated with hunger. Subsequent research has not clearly shown that hunger is really a mediating factor there, but clearly there are non-physiological effects. There are psychological effects, mental effects that go on in these studies that can influence performance as well. So just the knowledge of having a breakfast, knowing that you're not fasted, or thinking at least that you're not fasted, and consuming something might also have an effect. We also have some studies in which carbohydrate mouth rinsing, where you spit it out and you don't actually swallow the carbs, I'm sure that will be clipped, has a positive effect on performance. So just rinsing some Gatorade, for example, in your mouth and spitting it out can improve performance. And that seems to be mediated by dopaminergic receptors that are activated by carbs in the mouth or some other non-metabolic effect. So clearly there are psychological effects going on here. Further support for the lack of a physiological effect of carbohydrate intake comes from dose response studies. Studies in which they measured multiple carbohydrate intakes, such as low, medium, and high, and they looked at the effect on performance. In those studies, we typically see that if there is any effect whatsoever, there is no effect of increasing the carbohydrate content. For example, one of the studies by Krings et al. Looked at 15, 30, and 60 grams of carbohydrate per hour, and they found that all of those seemed to be a little better for performance than not consuming anything, but 15 grams was already enough to maximize performance. In that study, in fact, 15 grams had the absolute highest performance, non-significantly different than the other groups, so not even a trend in favor of higher carbohydrate intakes having a more positive effect on how many reps you can do in the gym. So overall, we can say it's likely suboptimal to train fasted. You might not have the same performance if you're training fasted than otherwise. However, it's not actually that massive of a difference to begin with. If there is an effect, part of that effect is likely psychological, and if there is a non-psychological effect, much of that is likely offset by even a very low carbohydrate intake. So take-home message is essentially here that you want to consume something, you don't want to train fasted, but even 15 grams of carbohydrates is probably enough, especially if you also add some protein to that, which I also recommend to fuel anabolism. So if you have something like 20 grams of protein minimum and 15 grams of carbohydrate minimum, you are probably set in terms of workout performance. There is a caveat, which I'll discuss in a moment. But first, why is it the case that we hear so many things about carbs being beneficial, you need carbs for energy, right? And we don't see effects in most of the studies on performance. How can that be? The reason you might benefit from carbohydrates before a workout is because the body turns glucose into glycogen that it stores in your muscles, and it burns up that glycogen via the glycolytic system to produce energy. Now, the amount of glycogen that the body burns in a session simply isn't that high. A good training session might burn some 300 to 500 calories, and above basal it might even be lower, because much of the workout you're not actually lifting, right? We do a set, maybe that's 30 seconds or something, and then most people rest much longer than that. So the rest to work ratio is really in favor of rest during most workouts. Moreover, eccentric muscle contractions are very energy efficient. So they don't actually require that much energy compared to concentric only exercise. That's why if you do something like bicycling, where you have non-stop concentric muscle actions, you burn more energy per minute than if you do strength training, and the requirements for glycogen can be much higher with something like repeated sprints on a bicycle ergometer or rowing. Any type of high intensity interval training typically has a much higher requirement for glycogen than strength training. If we run some exact numbers on those 300 to 500 calories, we see that the aerobic system still has a very large impact. It's like 20 to 70% depending on which study you look at. So that's mostly fueled by fat, because the rest periods allow the body to still produce most of its energy from fat. And if you subtract that, let's go with the lowest part of 20%, then we also have to subtract the creatine phosphate part of the energy production. So that's like the three main energy production systems that we have. You can essentially produce energy aerobically, or you can produce it from the creatine phosphate system, which relies on stored creatine phosphate bonds, which allow the body to rapidly produce some ATP. So this is kind of ATP that is energy which is directly available. So if we subtract that, which is 16 to 31% of the energy that during a typical set, then we are left with, say, 64% glycolytic components, so 64% of energy that the body would need actual carbohydrates for to burn glycogen. And we're using that upper end of the 500 calorie energy expenditure from a workout, then we are looking at 80 grams of carbohydrates to fuel a typical session. And if we assume about 500 grams of glycogen storage for a typical athlete, then we are looking at 16% glycogen depletion. That's obviously not nearly enough to disrupt neuromuscular functioning. You just don't burn enough glycogen in a workout to empty the gas tank, basically. And indeed, if we look at the literature on glycogen depletion, many studies have looked at this, then the largest depletion that we see from a given workout, even in bodybuilders doing many sets, in a leg day, for example, we find that the highest level of depletion is 39%, or 41% if you include isokinetic exercise. So basically 40% max. Now it turns out that you need around 40% or higher glycogen depletion to significantly disrupt neuromuscular functioning. It takes glycogen levels of approximately 250 to 300 millimole per kilogram dry weight to start interfering with neuromuscular functioning and contractile functioning of the muscle. So even a very high volume workout generally does not induce enough glycogen depletion to empty the gas tank enough so that you don't have enough energy to perform. Moreover, many of the carbohydrates that you consume before a workout actually are essentially too late, because those carbs are not in time to be digested, absorbed, and put into the muscle as glycogen, and therefore being available for energy production in that given workout. So the amount of carbohydrate intake that you consume before the workout actually doesn't matter as much as how many carbs you ate in between the last two workouts in general. By the way, do you like my content? Then you'll love my online PT certification course. Instead of spending 10 years sifting through misinformation and being confused by all the contradictory information on YouTube, in less than 1 year, you'll learn absolutely everything you need to know to transform your physique and, if you're a pro, the results of your clients. My research team and I have compiled quite literally all available information on muscle growth, fat loss, strength development, and health sciences into a practical take-home messages to take your physique to the next level. And we teach the methods that we ourselves actually use as coaches with our clients. ranging from Gen Pop to professional bodybuilders. You'll also get a PT toolkit with calculators, case studies, how-to guides, an exercise library, and hefty discounts to our partners' products and services. Of course, you shouldn't take my word for it. Check out the reviews of our former students in the link below. To my knowledge, we have the highest student satisfaction scores in the market. Okay, back to the video. I think a very telling example study is the one by Essen, Gustafsson, and Tesch. They found 28% depletion in the quads after 5 sets each of front squats, back squats, leg presses, and leg extensions to failure at 12 rep max. So that's 20 sets to failure in bodybuilders, and then they found 28% depletion in the quads. However, there are some studies in which volumes of 10 plus sets per muscle group do actually cause enough glycogen disruption, possibly in some of the highest threshold motor units, especially specifically the type 2 muscle fibers, to potentially interfere with performance. And if we zoom in specifically on studies of 11 plus sets per muscle group per session, then we do see a trend that the majority of studies starts favoring higher carbohydrate intakes, or at least carbs versus no carbs. Because again, none of these studies were isocaloric. They didn't equate for total energy content. Still, the trend, even in those conditions, is more clearly in favor of higher carbs than if you look at the studies where they have 7 or fewer sets per muscle group per session. Now, as a tangent, in my view, you shouldn't be doing 10 plus sets per muscle group per session anyway. There are multiple lines of research showing that you get sharply diminishing returns and essentially no more benefits once you go past around 6 sets per muscle group per session. That turns into junk volume and you mainly do more muscle damage, you stimulate more muscle protein breakdown, but there doesn't seem to be a big additional increase in muscle protein synthesis. So in my view, you're much better off splitting that volume up and doing 5 of those, say 10 sets in a different workout rather than doing 10 sets per muscle group on that one day. So I'm definitely not a fan of typical leg days or chest days where you do super high volume once per week for a certain muscle group. Anyway, that's a topic for a different video. If you're interested in more details about that, post it in the comments and I might do a full video on that. Back to carbs. After our review, a meta-analysis was published on the same topic and it replicated our findings almost to the letter. Reading their conclusions, carbohydrate ingestion has ergogenic effects, meaning performance-enhancing effects, on resistance training performance, where session duration was longer than 45 minutes and the fast duration was at least 8 hours. Conversely, carbohydrate ingestion did not significantly affect performance when session durations were shorter than 45 minutes or fast durations shorter than 8 hours. Those findings are almost exactly in line with our findings. Basically, there is no effect in settings where you are not training fasted and you're not doing a super high volume per session. In their case, they looked at minutes per session, and I'm not a fan of that because glycogen storage is local. So if you do a full body workout and you are training a lot of muscle groups, you might have a very long session, but that does not actually increase your glycogen requirements because only the sets per muscle group matter for the glycogen depletion for that muscle group. The body also has some glycogen in the liver, but by and large, a muscle relies on the glycogen stored in that specific muscle. So it's a local reservoir of energy essentially that the muscle has. And it doesn't matter if you also train another muscle group, it's not going to take energy from the biceps, it's not going to take glycogen from the biceps to fuel performance in the quads. Actually, that's not possible in the body. That reservoir of glycogen that's in the biceps can only be used by the biceps. So session duration doesn't matter. It also doesn't matter because if you take very long rest intervals, that actually reduces, given the same volume, the energy requirement of the session. Whereas if you use very short rest intervals, you can do even too much volume potentially in 45 minutes if you do some crazy drop set protocol, for example. So I think it's better to look at sets per muscle group per workout. And there the threshold seems to be around 10 sets that we start seeing, okay, if you do that, or if you do multiple workouts on a given day, then there might be a benefit of higher carbohydrate intakes pre-workout. If you're not doing that, and if you're not training fasted, then there really isn't any positive, meaningful effect of carbs on your workouts. So our conclusion overall was, based on the inconclusive evidence and potential for benefits but not harm, strength trainees are advised to consume at least 15 grams of carbohydrates and at least 0.3 grams per kilogram protein, about 20 grams for most individuals minimum, within 3 hours of their training sessions. If the workout contains 11 or more sets per muscle group, or there is another high-intensity workout planned that day for the same musculature, important, higher carbohydrate intakes up to 1.2 gram per kilogram per hour, so that's a lot of carbohydrate, may be warranted to maximize glycogen resynthesis in between workouts. So for most individuals, main take-home message is, within 3 hours of a workout, consume a meal, which can be a shake or anything, with at least 15 grams of carbohydrates, at least say 20 grams of protein, and then you're probably covered unless you're doing a super high volume session, which you probably shouldn't be doing anyway, but if you are, then you might benefit from some extra pre-workout carbs. Even then though, it's more important how many carbs you consumed in the whole previous day or the whole period in between your last workout and this workout, rather than how many carbs exactly are in your pre-workout meal. So for most individuals that are not training fasted, not doing crazy high volumes, you really don't have to worry much about pre-workout carbs. Just make sure you're not training completely fasted and you are fine. If you like this type of evidence-based content, I'd be honored if you like and subscribe.